And I want to share with you the Tedx natural gas story. It starts with Theo Colborn, and if you never got the chance to meet her or hear her talk, I'm sorry. She passed away last December at the age of 87. She's been an inspiration for so much progressive science and will serve as an inspiration for generations to come, and Tedx is a product of her passion. In the 1990s, Theo pioneered the field of endocrine disruption, showing that environmental chemicals can affect the hormone system at very low concentrations. Most endocrine disrupting chemicals are associated with fossil fuels, specifically oil and natural gas. Multiple chemicals that surface with the fossil fuels are separated out and collected as condensates. They are used as a feedstock in the production of thousands of chemicals. And additionally, these new chemicals are used in tens of thousands of consumer products that we use every day. They can be found in every environment and in the bodies of all living beings, and low levels of some of these chemicals have been shown to disrupt hormone action. These endocrine disruptors can play a role in so many disorders listed on this slide, including ADHD and infertility, obesity, cancer. In the early years of Tedx, we are known for establishing the adverse health effects from exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, but had not yet explored the source of the contaminants, the fossil fuel extraction. That changed when Theo received a call from a woman named Laura Amos, a resident of Garfield County, Colorado. In 2001, her water well had exploded at the same time that Encana was fracking 4 wells 1,000 feet from her home. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with a rare tumor on her adrenal gland, and both the tumor and her adrenal gland were removed. Laura felt there must be a connection between her contaminated well water and her tumor. And then she read about Theo and her research into the chemical 2BE, which can cause tumors on the adrenal gland as well as damage to other organs like the kidneys or liver. It can adversely affect the cardiovascular and endocrine systems, among others. Her daughter, who was breastfeeding at the time, was also exposed. And that was it. Theo knew she had to get involved. Our program grew from her communication with impacted individuals and communities. She visited their homes and gained the grassroots perspective, felt the frustration of wanting answers and not getting them from industry or the government. Rural Colorado was a test ground for unconventional drilling techniques, including hydraulic fracturing. Drilled communities began organizing, and Tedx was there as a resource. Theo felt she could help give these victims a voice using her background in environmental contaminants and endocrine disrupting chemicals. And this is how Tedx is unique. We can respond actively to community concerns and address them through scientific inquiry. People living in these communities are aware of contamination risks from gas development long before the science is available. They live it every day. We work with local, state, national, and international organizations to provide the background research that helps them educate their members and fight for changes that protect health and the environment. A great example from the very beginning of our natural gas program is our collaboration with Earthworks Oil and Gas Accountability Project, OGAP. They organized around drilling in the San Juan Basin in southwestern Colorado and northern New Mexico, and started learning about the products that were being used to drill and frack the nearby wells. They were able to gather material safety data sheets, MSDSs, which provide information on potential hazards to human and environmental health. Sara created a spreadsheet to organize the product information and separate out the chemicals listed as ingredients in the MSDSs, and I know she's going to talk a lot about that in her presentation. At the same time, industry was saying they used only soap, water, and guar gum, but we had the product data sheets that showed clearly there are lots of other chemicals used, and some were extremely toxic to humans and wildlife. Tedx received an EPA Environmental Justice Grant, allowing us to produce our DVD, What You Need to Know About Natural Gas Production. There are now over 15,000 of these DVDs in circulation, and we still send them out free of charge to anyone who requests them, or they can be downloaded on our website, or they can be found over there on the table too. There's someone's phone.
I left my phone up here, sorry.
Okay. Eventually, we had 944 products entered into our spreadsheet that can be found in this box on our website. What had started as a tool to document products used in Colorado spread to include states from across the country. Now, one of the most striking conclusions was that 43% of product data sheets disclose less than 1% of product composition, so basically none. Because the MSDSs were so incomplete, we could only identify 353 chemicals. Our first paper, focusing on natural gas operations from a public health perspective, was published in 2011, and it is still featured on the journal homepage as the most read article. It has become a key resource for individuals and community groups concerned with possible health risks that can accompany natural gas extraction, and has been cited in 70 journal articles. We've been invited to present this information many times across the country and are now creating an interactive database that will be available on our website so that individuals can more easily extract chemical information. Now, there are a few key findings that have driven our continuing research in natural gas production. Okay. This table lists 11 health categories along the bottom axis and shows the percentage of the 353 chemicals that we researched that affect each organ or system. You can see that greater than 75% of chemicals can affect the sensory organs, like the eyes or skin, the respiratory and the gastrointestinal system, and the liver. Over 50% of the chemicals can affect the brain and nervous system. Together, these four categories on the left of the table represent the more immediate health effects that can occur soon after drilling begins. The profile of health symptoms reported from impacted communities we visited confirm this, although it's too soon to know if there will be chronic effects that could turn up months or years later, for example, effects on the cardiovascular system or endocrine effects. As if this is not alarming enough, the percentage of volatile chemicals with potential adverse health effects was greater in nearly all categories. And we kept coming back to this volatile chemical profile. The more immediate effects, those on the left of the table, were found in over 80% of the chemicals studied. These were the symptoms people were reporting: the rashes, coughing, wheezing, dizziness, headaches, nausea. Although fracking had captured national attention, we noticed citizen complaints typically began during the drilling stage, before fracking had even begun on a particular well. At this point, Tedx was approached by a concerned landowner who was frustrated and ready to set up her own air monitoring station. She had what doctors and residents locally referred to as the Encana cough, Encana being the same company that fracked those wells near Laura Amos's house. There were already 130 producing gas wells within 1 mile of the landowner's home, and soon development would begin on 16 new wells. We wanted to learn what surfaced with the methane during drilling. We worked with experts at an analytical air laboratory to design a weekly sampling program spanning 1 year. Multiple tests were run to look for volatile organic compounds, VOCs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, and carbonyls. Colorado recently increased drill rig setbacks from homes to 500 feet. But at the sampling site, which was 0.7 miles or 3,700 feet away from the well pad, 61 different chemicals were detected, and nearly half were endocrine disruptors. The natural gas signature chemicals, the light, mostly benign alkanes that surface with the methane, were there as expected, along with chemicals deemed as hazardous air pollutants by the EPA. We are particularly concerned about the BTEX group, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene. And Ashley Bolden from Tedx led a comprehensive review into the health effects from exposure to low levels of these chemicals that was published just last month. Health effects of BTEX were found from exposure in the parts per billion range. Studies of benzene, for example, have shown levels in oil and gas fields can be in the parts per million range, which is thousands of times higher than the concentrations that were associated with health effects found in the review. These concentrations are also above what is deemed safe by the EPA. We are also concerned about the 12 polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that were detected in the air samples. PAHs are often the result of incomplete combustion, but some can be released from underground during drilling. In other research, 8 of these PAHs were analyzed in a series of longitudinal cohort studies led by Dr. Pereira, the director of the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. New York City pregnant women wore backpack monitors to measure the levels of PAHs in the air they were breathing. The research team has followed the children of the pregnant women over the last 8 years, and findings include early health effects, like preterm births and low birth weight, and later effects, like lower scores of mental development and lower IQ scores, attention and behavioral problems, obesity. And most recently, at 8 years old, they discovered reduced white matter on the left side of the children's brains that was associated with slower cognitive processing and more severe ADHD behaviors and aggression. In rural Garfield County, we found levels 3 times higher than what they found in New York City. And this has inspired a future Tedx project to conduct a review on the health effects of PAH exposure. Meanwhile, we published our air study, an exploratory study of air quality near natural gas operations, so it could reach a larger audience, including academic scientists and the media. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission invited Tedx to present these findings at a hearing on setbacks, which is the minimum distance oil and gas facilities must be from buildings or public areas. Given our findings, we are asking for a 1-mile setback. The commissioners responded that although chemicals were detected in the air, it cannot be proven that people were breathing them in. We would need to prove human exposure and provide baseline data showing these chemicals were not detected in the air prior to sampling. At about the same time, we learned that the Bureau of Land Management had proposed leasing 30,000 acres of public land in our valley. And honestly, I felt defeated. My first thought was to move to help protect the health of my family, but that would be like losing part of my identity. And so I asked Theo what she would do, and she said, "You stay and fight." And when a local grassroots organization, Citizens for a Healthy Community, CHC, asked to collaborate with us on an exploratory baseline air study, it became the perfect opportunity to design a study doing exactly what the commissioners had asked for: show personal exposure. This type of baseline sampling has, to our knowledge, never been done in a community prior to drilling. Having this data can allow communities to hold industry accountable for changes in air quality if drilling should begin in the future. So we designed a 1-year-long sampling project, adapting the backpack air monitor setup used in the New York City study. Volunteers wore the backpack on their property for 24 hours, with sampling locations spread throughout our county. The backpacks included 2 separate samplers to collect the PAHs, as well as the non-methane hydrocarbons that are connected to natural gas operations. Although we are still analyzing the results, we know about half of these chemicals were detected. As you can see, our work has been able to evolve very fluidly. At the end of every project became a new collaborative project between Tedx and concerned communities. Many issues we focused on, like the very low disclosure rate of product ingredients and the health effects from exposure to chemicals found in the air near drilling operations, were ahead of their time and have helped influence related research and regulatory change. We are pursuing new research further connecting the chemicals surrounding the process of oil and natural gas development to endocrine disruption to continue making the fossil fuel connection. And I'd like to thank here's our staff at Tedx and our funders, and thanks to our collaborators, and all of our papers and chemical database can be found on our website.
So we're going to have questions towards the end of the panel, so please write down any questions you have, and we'll be taking questions all together as we wrap up. So I couldn't really hope for a better introduction to my talk than to have a talk from Tedx in the beginning, because Tedx really set the course for my research. I worked with the Endocrine Disruption Exchange as a graduate student at MIT while I was working on my PhD, and it was really the work with them that has inspired and totally changed the course of my practice, from really moving from an anthropologist of science who generally does participant observation, where you go and you sit and you study and you talk to people and you live with them, and then you go away and then you write about them, and you write about them generally for an audience of people who aren't them, who read about them, and they rarely read what you've written about them, and so it's all a bit complicated, very, very generative and very useful, but I have really moved towards trying to think about how my field, science and technology studies, can become much more applied and much more engaged with the communities that I work with, and in taking the knowledge that I generate and applying it to sort of where the rubber meets road. And it was really working with Theo who inspired that change in direction for me. So I first came across Theo's work when I was, before I went to graduate school, I was working in a lab at Harvard University trying to develop an assay, a test for endocrine disruptors using these little eggs shown up here. They're the egg of an African clawed frog that responds to hormones to mature. And so we were interested in using this as a test for progesterone or testosterone mimics or antagonists. And this lab work was so very complicated. The work with non-phenol and plastic tubes had already come out at that stage, so we had to ditch all of the plastics in the lab and replace everything with glassware, which put me as the lowest rung on the lab food chain, washing all of that glassware, which we had just contaminated with various different endocrine disrupting chemicals that we were testing at very, very low doses. And so it raised this question of, will we ever clean the glassware well enough? And will we ever get back to this clean, pure lab setting? And then, of course, that clean, pure lab setting was anything but that, because all of our frogs had been raised in plastic tanks since birth for generation after generation. And so I was really fascinated with the limitations of the lab as a space for studying endocrine disruptors. And it was reading Theo's work and the very broad view she had to take of wildlife studies, of putting them together with human epidemiological studies, with tissue studies, to tell the story of endocrine disruption really required looking beyond the lab. And so I reached out to her as a graduate student. When I went to MIT, I wrote a paper about her work and interviewed her. And I said, Theo, is there any chance I could maybe come out and study with you? And she said, yes, sure. It'll be very boring. We have a very small town. There's only one stoplight. You're not going to have anybody to talk to. But sure, that interests you. And so, duly warned, I went, and it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, you saw some pictures that Kim just showed, but it was just a landscape I'd never seen before, never experienced before as someone who grew up in London. And I got there thinking, I'm going to work on endocrine disruptors. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to study with Theo and I'm thinking about endocrine disruptors. And as I got there my first night, she said, no, I don't think endocrine disruptors is what you're going to work on, Sara. I think you should work on chemicals used in natural gas extraction. And, hydraulic fracking was not the household world that it was then. I mean, I have my first writings of trying to spell out hydraulic fracking, the first time I ever heard the term, and they're completely wrong. And she told me the story of Laura Amos as we sat down for dinner my first night there, and the moving tale that Kim just told of this woman whose water well exploded. It destroyed the value of her property. It threw her health into crisis. It created questions about her child's health, and she calling Theo initiated this new cycle of connection between researchers and her experience. And I was really impressed that Theo's research organization could sort of split its focus and take up this new topic, driven by the emergent health concerns in her community. And so this is the memo that Theo had written about 2BE and submitted to the Forest Service describing the link to adrenal tumours. And Laura Amos had come across that memo and read it and had this, oh my God, could my tumour be related to what happened to my water 3 years ago? And so based on that, I was thrown into this world of hydraulic fracking, and there's just endless lists of chemicals and ols and Fs and words I didn't understand, and started to build. This is the early database that we put together on paper of the different chemicals found in the products used in gas and oil extraction. And so I worked during that first December and returned in the summertime to work on building this database, searching all available health data associated with these chemicals, many of which were very old studies. And in 2006, Tedx began first publishing their results. And as an anthropologist of science, I was really struck by the way they described this project. They talked about it not in terms of certainty, not in terms of discovery, but in terms of exploration, in terms of glimpsing the pattern of possible health hazards for those living in proximity to oil and gas production, or well, to gas production. And this was really the framework of the project, because it had to be exploratory. You know, in 2005, the Energy Policy Act exempted hydraulic fracking from regulation by the EPA, so there was no disclosure at this period of time for the chemicals used throughout this process. And really what my dissertation ended up following was the way in which Tedx's work, in combination with Earthworks, OGAP, and community organisers like Deb Thomas, helped build grounds for disclosure, helped make fracking a publicly known word, and helped make it a public health concern. And you saw a bit of this in Kim's presentation. This is another way that they presented the data back in 2009. And again, as an anthropologist, I was struck by this being a holistic way of looking at the practice. They weren't picking out a single chemical of concern. They weren't picking out the most hazardous chemical of the bunch. They, in fact, actively resisted that idea, and instead said, we need to think about all of these chemicals together, and we don't need to think about just one health outcome. We need to think about wildlife outcomes at the same time as we think about brain and neurological outcomes, at the same time as we think about cardiovascular outcomes. And I was really struck by this as an approach, as a precautionary approach that took into account all of these different factors and helped create grounds for these communities who, as Kim said, are experiencing respiratory distress, kidney dysfunction, adrenal gland tumours, and be able to give them a narrative where they could see themselves within these categories. And you can start to say, oh, my respiratory distress might be related to my daughter's kidney problem, might be related to the tumours that are showing up on my livestock, and gave them a space from which to narrate their illnesses together. So this isn't an epidemiological study, it's not a toxicological study, it's not focusing on single fate and chemical transport and human exposure, but really on this aggregation of chemicals and this aggregation of health effects. So they found, and this is again older data from 2009, 4 to 14 health effects associated with 86% of the chemicals used in fracking. And so they began using this basically as a map, as a way that communities could start to interpret their health problems, as a map for future research, and also as a map to known unknowns. So the other way that they really generated grounds for full disclosure, and Kim's slide showed this beautifully, that they only had full disclosure of information on these chemicals in 1% of the products that they looked at. And so they really started to build here was a tool that many different people could bring to bear in their different realm of expertise. So you have people like Josh Fox. Hearing the Tedx's early works was one of the things that inspired him to begin Gasland. He heard this from a group in the Marcellus Shale who'd heard it from Theo, and he read Tedx's work, and it inspired him to begin that documentary film, which really helped make this a household word. Theo brought this to Waxman, Markey, and DeGette, and helped begin the first federal investigations of chemicals used in hydraulic fracking and throughout the drilling milling process. And very importantly, as Deb's going to touch on more in her work, looking at 2BE and the database that they first put together of hazardous chemicals potentially found in fracking fluids helped stimulate EPA's first ability to look at water contamination in Pavilion, Wyoming, which, while contested, was one of the first federal level findings of water contamination from fracking, and it was contamination again with 2BE. So Tedx's work from an anthropological perspective, I was inspired by this as a kind of science that supports hypothesis generation, that stimulates further investigation by scientists, that considers a practice holistically, and it focuses on enabling identification of emerging health hazards, which couldn't be more useful to communities, right? To be able to look around and say, these could potentially be linked as a platform for popular epidemiology, and really starting to think about how can a much more proactive science help us identify emerging health threats. So I came away from my work with Tedx just sort of mind blown and thinking, well, how can my work contribute? I didn't want to just go and write stories, though I could have, of many of the community members that I worked with who were really suffering. And it's very easy to do that as an anthropologist, to fall into the trap of recording another person's suffering, and with the hope that in the end that record will contribute. And then many times it absolutely has. But I also wanted to think about, well, how can we be involved in designing and thinking about environmental science and thinking about our practice differently? And so back at MIT, I started a research group called Extract that developed web tools for community monitoring of the oil and gas industry, trying to think about how can I get involved in building databases that are similarly generative? How can we think about designing an information architecture that empowers communities to monitor their environment and monitor industries around them. And so one of the first tools we produced was WellWatch, which was the first integrated map of natural gas and oil extraction in 5 different states. And we basically mapped that data and connected it with a Wikipedia framework so that you could click on any of those red dots, which are oil and gas wells around Fort Worth, Texas, and you could write a complaint or a note or share an image and share the information that you had about that location. And so what we did was create a very free format where people could just start adding their experiences. They could add photos, they could add narratives, and they could self-organize what they wanted to complain about or what they had information about. And lots of people were very upset about water contamination. So these are water complaints from Pennsylvania, which was undergoing the beginnings of the Marcellus Shale boom while we were doing this project. And we had submissions like this one, where an acid spill on a farmer's pond killed all that plant life in the background and burned through those tree trunks. Now, this is the kind of small-scale disaster that's a disaster for that pond, right? And it's a disaster for that farm, but it's not the kind of thing that aggregates into the popular consciousness right now. We don't have a news system that's going to report on damage to my pond. And so I was really interested in how can we start to build that news system? How can we start to build that system that holds an industry accountable for its daily damages? And not separate those daily damages from health damages. So we had other people, for instance, this is a symptoms and odor log from Colorado, from Garfield County, describing the experiences of one landowner, the time she experiences, the time she smelled things, building up to the torrential nosebleeds that she started to experience. And her and other community members in that area supported their reports with things like this doctor's note from a doctor who organized and worked with many of the communities in Garfield County, describing the symptoms that his patients were experiencing, and his thinking that this was linked to air quality contamination from the neighboring oil and gas. And we had communities share their images of things like their son's rashes. And so what we were interested in trying to create was a space for communities to come together to deal with their shared risk from a distributed industry. So these are the maps of complaints that we found, that we got from Rifle and Silt, which is an area in Garfield, Colorado, right along I-70. And so unfortunately, this was just a pilot version of this project, but I'm working with Deb Thomas now and fractracker.org to develop a second generation of this tool called Well Communities. And I'll just quickly speed up because there's only 3 minutes left. I'm really interested in trying to think about how can we as social scientists get engaged for building platforms for popular epidemiology? How can we start building rigorous spaces for community-based research that really allows our communities who are wrestling with very similar problems in very different geographical locations to connect with each other? And so building on that work, I was part of co-founding an online community called publiclab.org that develops low-cost tools for community-based environmental monitoring. One of the things we came across with WellWatch and thinking about things like the backpack study is the sheer expense of most of our environmental science tools make them not available to communities, and that we actually haven't really thought about how to design tools for studying our environment that are useful to the everyday person. And so Public Lab got its start during the Gulf oil spill by creating a low-cost way of making satellite-like maps using helium balloons and attaching just a cheap digital camera to them on a long piece of string. And because there was a flyover ban during the Gulf oil spill that prevented any aerial imaging below 30,000 feet, there was a real hole in the data. There was no way for communities to generate maps of what was happening during the spill. And so we worked with the Louisiana Bucket Brigade to organize communities to go out and make their own maps. And so that tool, grassroots mapping that allows communities to kind of have their own satellite, really is an attempt to try and overcome some of the barriers that Gudji really touched upon to community-based environmental research. And that's that the tools we have are expensive, they tend to be limited to the hands of experts, and that really contributes to this lag in knowledge between people on the ground and experts, where people are already experiencing environmental health problems. They're already feeling sick. They know they're ill, and we need a much more rapid turnaround to address those problems as they emerge. And this is a big problem with the structure of our environmental work. We generally have a structure where people on the ground don't own the data, and that leaves them out of the actual analysis process and actually participating in making knowledge about their own conditions. And this is particularly problematic because many of these communities abut or live against industries that have a far greater capacity than them to generate data. So through Public Lab, I've been returning to gas patch issues and trying to design tools for communities living around oil and gas extraction. And I'll just quickly describe one tool that we're looking at for mapping just a health hazard, hydrogen sulfide, a neurotoxic gas that's associated with between 15 to 25% of the US gas wells. And this is a problem already noted in Colorado communities where bucket sampling, air sampling in homes found H2S above 185 times EPA's allowable levels. And, how did industry respond to this? They started arguing about whose well could be producing that H2S, and it's certainly not ours. And so we've been interested in finding a way to map which wells are producing hydrogen sulfide so they can become targets for advocacy. And this is increasingly a problem because 15.3 million Americans now live within a mile of a well that's been drilled since 2000. But we haven't developed any protection for communities who are living amidst this new industry, who literally abut these occupational sites. So I've been working on a low-cost tool for mapping H2S using photographic paper of all things. Photographic paper has silver in it, which tarnishes with exposure to H2S. So areas that have higher H2S are much richer and darker in color, and they're very low cost. You can put them out over a large area. And so we've been piloting this in Wyoming for the past couple of years. And we did testing on a ranch that had been experiencing long-term problems with H2S exposure, with the landowners getting sick, with their cattle getting sick. And so in the darkroom here, we borrowed the darkroom from Northeastern, started making the canisters with photographic paper in, and set them out around the oil wells on that property. And we found really significant levels of H2S right at the point of discharge, where produced water from these wells is discharged into the riparian system, into the what becomes the streams in this area. And H2S isn't just hazardous to humans, it's ecotoxic to aquatic life at very low levels. And we complemented this method with grab samples of air for H2S at the same time, and we found 48 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide at that discharge canal. That's 735 times greater than ATSTR's intermediate threshold for exposure. So what Theo's work really inspired me to do was to take a much more applied approach to my research, to really start thinking about how science and technology studies can actively engage with the sciences to think about building new platforms for knowledge and new tools for research that really enable us to start building environmental literacy and the ability to study and own our environments through owning our own data. So thank you very much. Deb Thomas. So now we have the pleasure of hearing from Deb Thomas, who you actually saw a picture of her in one of my slides, who's been another absolute inspiration for my work. There you go.
Don't make me cry yet. As Sara said, my name's Deb Thomas. Thank you so much for allowing me to come here today. I've been a community organizer in Wyoming for 17 years. And I'm going to just take you through some slides about what it looks like from the ground. As in most places where oil and gas development is taking place, we see a new world. And this is where I live. I wish it was that house, but it's not. That's my neighbor's house. This is drilling for gas in the Line Creek subdivision in Clark, Wyoming. We live on the east side of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem on the Montana-Wyoming border along the Beartooth Front of the Absaroka Range. And how do I move this? Okay. So we're going to talk about some of the places where I started my work in Wyoming. You'll see on the top above Cody, Wyoming is Clark, where I live. To the east is Deaver, where Sara just showed you the pictures of the hydrogen sulfide mapping. And down in the center of the state in Indian country in the middle of Wyoming is Pavilion. So this is a map of the rural residential area that I live in. And you'll see it's created by one of the interns that worked with me on these projects, Kate Kennedy. The blue dots are homes and the red dots are development sites. So you can see how close the proximity is to where this development is taking place in terms of where people live. As in many places, impacts to water is where the first threats are recognized by the community. And the Bennett Creek pad, which is just across the road from our house, was only a few hundred yards from Line Creek, and it was also located in a critical area as identified by the regulators in Wyoming. These were lined pits that were used to contain the drilling fluids during the drilling of one of the wells on this pad. However, you can see what happens to the liners. We have extremely high winds there. They were all torn. The flares from the well burned the liners. And when it was time to close the pits, they didn't dry them out. They didn't take any of the waste out of the area. They simply buried everything on site. By 2004, a potable water well had been drilled on the southeast border of these pits. So we were really worried about what that was going to mean in terms of not only the creek, but the groundwater that supplied us all with our drinking water. Concerns grew as pallets and barrels of chemicals were moved onto the Bennett Creek pad. The chemicals that make up fracking fluids are often the same chemicals that are used in drilling fluids, although you don't hear as much about the drilling process. But instead of being mixed at mixing facilities where fracking fluids are, the drilling fluids are just brought into the pads and stored there until they're dumped down the hole while they're drilling. The second real set of concerns, or one of the many concerns that we had at this pad, were the waste pits that were unlined on the same pad. A series of 6 pits were opened and closed over the period of 4 wells being drilled. And they would just periodically open up a pit, dump some waste in it, cover it back up, open up another pit, dump some more waste in it. By the time that these pictures were taken, which was about 4 to 5 years into the development in that drainage, multiple complaints had been made by the people living there. There was already one notice of violation from the state of Wyoming, which is pretty damn hard, let me tell you, in Wyoming. And the governor and all of the regulators that deal with oil and gas in the state of Wyoming had been to Clark. And yet none of our concerns as residents were being heard, and they were doing nothing to curb the development in that area. So when I started working on these issues in 1999, I became very involved with an organization that's been mentioned by Kim and Sara, which is the Oil and Gas, or at that time was the Oil and Gas Accountability Project, which is now a project of Earthworks. The nonprofit was started by a woman named Gwen Lackelt, who did amazing work organizing communities in that area in the Southwest, and also was reaching out and helping people all through the Rocky Mountain region. So in 2005, I attended a No Gaps People's Summit in Farmington, New Mexico. I think it was the 5th summit that OCAP had done. It was the 2nd one that I'd gone to. I met this amazing woman named Theo Colburn. By then, she had, of course, written Our Stolen Future. She'd done tons of work over with endocrine disruption. She was very well known for her work, but she was just starting to connect with the activist community that I was involved with. So it was the first time that I'd met her. And I couldn't believe it. First of all, she was recovering from eye surgery, so she had a patch over one eye, and she was no spring chicken at that time, let me tell you. And so she was a little bit unstable from not being able to see very well. We went on this crazy-ass bus tour through the oil and gas fields around Farmington, New Mexico. I don't know, there probably were 40 of us on this bus, and it was hot and dry and dusty, and she was such a trooper. I mean, I was just watching her, and I was so intrigued by who this person was, her knowledge, and just the chutzpah she had to be hanging with us on this bus. That was my first experience with Theo. A year later, Windsor Energy's Crosby 25-3 gas well blew out next to our house. My family was among the 23 households that were evacuated for 3 days until they killed the well. We were forced to leave all our livestock and animals because we had to go very quickly. And my community still suffers the consequences of this incident. As you can see, the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality estimated emissions of 97 tons of volatile organic compounds and 11 tons of hazardous air pollutants, which is 2 tons of benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, 101 tons of methane, and 43 tons of ethane. That was an estimate. And I stopped at the top of my driveway and took these pictures when I was being evacuated. After 9 years, these are models of the groundwater contamination that resulted as this well blew from the bottom up through all the drinking water aquifers. So after 9 years, the contamination in the shallow aquifers has started to naturally attenuate. It was flushing really quickly through that drainage. But the deeper aquifers remain contaminated and appear to still be sourcing from the lower zones where our consultants tell us the geology was fractured. The Crosby 25 gas well blowout monitoring project consists of over 100 groundwater well points, 25 private drinking water wells, 6 springs that flow into Line Creek, and 5 points on the creek. The only air monitoring that was done through this whole disaster was the state came in and did air monitoring about, over a week after the blowout was stopped, and have never done any air monitoring around the emissions that are occurring from the pads in that area. So, of course, we were worried, and we started requesting that they do air monitoring, the state, which they wouldn't. We kept persisting, and the other thing that we were really after were the drilling fluid constituents, which nobody would give us. They told us, as Kim talked about, it's like the same stuff that's in your refrigerator. We were like, yeah, right. So we finally, after the blowout, we finally received a list of the drilling fluid, a partial list of the drilling fluid constituents from the blowout, and Theo came to our rescue. Analysis done by the Endocrine Disruption Exchange evaluated the health effects associated with the 42 products that were identified in the drilling fluids. All of the products on Tedx's list are associated with adverse health effects, and they can although the MSDSs that we got explaining the chemicals said that there were no hazardous ingredients. 21% had 1 to 3 associated health effects, and 79% had 4 to 14 health effects. 33% of the products contained 1 or more chemicals considered to be endocrine disruptors. We finally understood from that moment on why we were so sick, why we had these crazy respiratory difficulties, kidney diseases, all kinds of problems, rashes, headaches, you name it. It started to like gel in our heads, thanks to Theo and the amazing staff at Tedx. So shortly after the blowout in 2007, I was called by a group of citizens in the Pavilion area, again, in Indian country in the middle of Wyoming, Fremont County. And it's just east of Pavilion, Wyoming, actually, is where the actual field sets. This is the map that Sara showed you a few minutes ago. And again, the blue sites are residences, the red are gas wells. These are all small farmers. They don't use a lot of pesticides or fertilizers because they're growing mainly alfalfa. So they feed their cows on the alfalfa, and then the manure fertilizes the fields. So there's no other industrial anything in this area. There's not even a road that goes through, a highway that goes through this area. I love this slide because it's obviously industry's pot of gold, right? But for the people who are living with this, it is not a pot of gold, I can tell you that. Many of the people that were there already recognized that they were really sick. And they all knew that their water wells were impacted because they could see it. And they'd been requesting help from the state for about 10 years by the time I got there. They still didn't have any concrete answers. In fact, the state had never even done any testing at all in that area. So after I got there, the residents requested that EPA come in and conduct site inspections. And as a result, in 2008, the EPA began the Pavilion groundwater contamination investigation. Around that time, everybody living there also was recognizing that the emissions from the over 220 wells were impacting their air and their health. And so we started requesting that the state also do air monitoring. Of course, they declined our requests. But in, late 2009, we organized a public meeting for the community members. And we invited, of course, all the Wyoming regulators and the lawmakers and the usual cast of characters. At that meeting, Jeremy Nichols from Wild Earth Guardians and Dr. Theo Colborn from the Endocrine Disruption Exchange explained the potential toxic emissions known to be released from oil and gas development, the risks, and the associated impacts to human health. Theo was not able to travel to that meeting, but she agreed to present her latest video, which Kim talked about, what you need to know about natural gas production. I encourage all of you to grab one of those and take a look at it. But the DV hadn't actually been produced at that point. And so Theo said, well, we'll just do it over the phone, We'll just do it from the internet. So unfortunately, we got to the venue and we didn't have any internet service or any cell phone service. So we mic'd the landline in the kitchen at the community center where we're at, and another one of my colleagues, Jennifer Goldman, clicked through Theo's slides as she gave the presentation over the phone. It was crazy, and I'll tell you what, Theo did not miss a beat. It was unbelievable. And I'll never forget how her vivid presentation resonated with that community, because people suddenly recognized why they were sick. They had something to put a name to, because she was explaining what was happening to them, what they were exposed to, and it was clicking with all of these people. So after the meeting, we continued to make requests to the state for air monitoring, and of course, nothing. And as the national fracking debate heated up, so did the issues in Pavilion. During monitoring, EPA found 2-butoxyethanol, 2BE, and that pushed Pavilion into the national spotlight for sure. In November of 2011, EPA released a draft report connecting groundwater contamination in the Pavilion area to oil and gas development. In June of 2013, they announced that it would not finalize or seek peer review of its draft Pavilion groundwater report, but would instead turn it back over to the state of Wyoming, who hadn't done anything to help anybody in any of the areas of Wyoming who were impacted. So at that point, we decided that the communities that I worked in across the state, that we would band together and start to do our own air monitoring. And so we worked with Shale test to do fluorimetry and SUMA canisters. We worked with Sara Wylie at Northeastern University and public labs to do a bunch of monitoring around H2S. And these are pictures of that she alluded to. These are the actual canisters in the field that we set. I mentioned the interns that I had working with me, Caitlin Kennedy and Evelyn Meisenbacher from Drew University, who were fantastic. Evie helped chronicle the stories of the people. She did a lot of interviews with our community members across the state. And Kate did particulate monitoring and worked in the field with me actually for about 6 months out of the 3 years that we conducted this project. All of the residents in these communities worked with the monitoring. We'd worked with Global Community Monitor using Tedlar bags and formaldehyde badges in their bucket brigade. And as a result, we were part of a 6-state monitoring project that resulted in a report titled Warning Signs, Toxic Air Pollutants Identified at Oil and Gas Development Sites, and the first peer-reviewed study of hazardous air pollutants near fracking and other oil and gas production sites in multiple U.S. locations, published in the journal Environmental Health. We're really proud of that. So I continue to work with impacted communities in and outside of Wyoming now. And I have to tell you that the way we're really building power is through collaboration. Working, of course, with the impacted people who are the experts on what's happening to them because they live with it, they see it, they see the changes in their environment, in their water, in their air, in their health. They are the experts. But also, we've just been so lucky to work with incredible academics and scientists and organizations, health professionals, in weaving this fabric that is just growing stronger and stronger over time. And the proof of that is that I'm here. During the summer of 2011, I had the honor of doing an internship at Tedx and working with the Endocrine Disruption Exchange in beautiful Pavilion, Colorado. And I learned invaluable lessons from her and from her staff. Kim was there. It was an amazing time for me. Excuse me. And it was really meaningful for the communities that I represent. Everybody there went out of their way to help us and to really give us some technical expertise and show us how to use the data. But my fondest memories are being able to spend time with Theo. She was this brilliant scientist who knew the horrific problems that we're facing better than most people, but she still took time to share the natural beauty of the land that she loves so much with me and with others. She was beautiful and charming. She was also very kind and very generous. She always was available to give us support. There was never a time when I called her or emailed her that she or Carol or Kim didn't respond to me. She always listened to our theories, no matter how crazy they were. And she was never constrained by ego or annoyed by our ignorance. Theo had a huge impact on me from that first bus trip that we took together. And she inspired me to continue working on oil and gas issues for sure. I'm missing my last slide here. As I left Paonia, I stopped by her house to thank her for allowing me to come there and work with her. And the last words she said to me were, don't ever stop doing what you're doing. And she said the most powerful thing you can do is tell your story. And so I want to thank you all for letting me tell my story.